hey, I love to read books, but the old school way is just so inconvenient, lugging this around on the bus, trying to read it at work. It's gotta be a better way. It's the 21st century. Oh, do I got a good audio story for you today. Check it out.
Chapter 9 of The Man Upstairs and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Man Upstairs by P.G.Wodehouse. Chapter 9, Archibald's Benefit. Archibald Mealing was one of those golfers in whom desire outruns performance. Nobody could have been more willing than Archibald. He tried, and he tried very hard. Every morning before he took his bath, he'd stand in front of his mirror and practice swings. Every night before he went to bed, he'd read the golden words of some master on the subject of putting, driving, or approaching. Yet on the links, most of his time was spent in retrieving lost balls or replacing pieces of America. Whether it was that Archibald pressed too much or pressed too little, whether it was that his club deviated from the dotted line which joined the 2 points A and B in the illustrated plate of the man making the brassy shot in the Hints on Golf book, or whether it was that he was pursued by some malignant fate, I do not know. Archibald rather favored the last theory. The important point is that in his 31st year, after 6 seasons of untiring effort, Archibald went in for a championship and won it. Archibald, mark you, whose golf was a kind of blend of hockey, Swedish drill, and buck and wing dancing. I know the ordeal I must face when I make such a statement. I see clearly before me the solid phalanx of men from Missouri, some urging me to tell it to the King of Denmark, others insisting that I produce my Eskimos. Nevertheless, I do not shrink. I state once more that in his 31st year, Archibald Mealing went in for a golf championship and won it. Archibald belonged to a select little golf club, the members of which lived and worked in New York, but played in New Jersey. Men of substance, financially as well as physically. They had combined their superfluous cash and with it purchased a strip of land close to the sea. This land had been drained, to the huge discomfort of a colony of mosquitoes who had come to look on the place as their own private property, and converted it into links, which had become a sort of refuge for incompetent golfers. The members of the Cape Pleasant Club were easygoing refugees from other and more exacting clubs, men who pottered rather than raced round the links, men, in short, who had grown tired of having to stop their game and stand aside in order to allow perspiring experts to whiz past them. The Cape Pleasant golfers did not make themselves slaves to the game. Their language, when they foozled, was gently regretful rather than sulphurous. The moment in the day's play which they enjoyed most was when they were saying, "Well, here's luck," in the clubhouse. It will therefore be readily understood that Archibald's inability to do a hole in single figures did not handicap him at Cape Pleasant, as it might have done at St. Andrews. His kindly clubmates took him to their bosoms to a man, and looked on him as a brother. Archibald's was one of those admirable natures which prompted the possessor frequently to remark, "These are on me," and his fellow golfers were not slow to appreciate the fact they all loved Archibald. Archibald was on the floor of his bedroom one afternoon picking up the fragments of his mirror. A friend had advised him to practice the Walter J. Travis lofting shot when the telephone bell rang. He took up the receiver and was hailed by the comfortable voice of McKay, the club secretary. "Is that Mealing?" asked McKay. "Say, Archie, I'm putting your name down for our championship competition. That's right, isn't it?" "Sure," said Archibald. "When does it start?" "Next Saturday." "Oh, that's me." "Good for you." Oh, Archie, hello. A man I met today told me you were engaged. Is that a fact?" "Sure," murmured Archibald, blushfully. The wire hummed with McKay's congratulations. "Oh, thanks," says Archibald. "Thanks, old man. What? Oh, yes. Milsom's her name. Oh, by the way, her family have taken a cottage at Cape Pleasant for the summer. Some distance from the links. Yeah, very convenient, isn't it? Goodbye. Archibald hung up the receiver and resumed his task of gathering up the fragments. Now, McKay happened to be of a romantic and sentimental nature. He was by profession a chartered accountant and inclined to be stout, and all rather stout chartered accountants are sentimental. McKay was the sort of man who keeps old ball programs in bundles of letters tied round with a lilac ribbon. At country houses where they lingered in the porch after dinner to watch the moonlight flooding the quiet garden, it was McKay and his colleague who lingered longest. McKay knew Ella Wheeler Wilcox by heart and could take Browning without anesthetics. It's not to be wondered at, therefore, that Archibald's remark about his fiancée coming to live at Cape Pleasant should give him food for thought. It appealed to him. He reflected on it a good deal during the day, and running across Sigsbee, a fellow Cape Pleasanter, after dinner that night at the Sybarites Club, he spoke of the matter to him. It so happened that both had dined excellently and were looking on the world with a sort of cozy benevolence. They were in the mood when men pat small boys on the head and ask them if they mean to be president when they grow up. Said McKay, "I called up Archie Mealing today. Do you know he was engaged?" "I did hear something about it. Girl of the name of Wilson or Milsom. She's going to spend the summer at Cape Pleasant, Archie tells me." "Well, then she'll have a chance of seeing him play in the championship competition." McKay sucked his cigar in silence for a while, watching with dreamy eyes the blue smoke as it curled ceilingward. Then, when he spoke, his voice was singularly soft. "Do you know, Sigsbee," he said, sipping his maraschino with a gentle melancholy, "do you know there's something wonderfully pathetic to me in this business? I see the whole thing so clearly." There was a kind of quiver in the poor old chap's voice when he said, "She is coming to Cape Pleasant," which told me more than any words could have done. It's a tragedy in its way, Sigsbee. We may smile at it, think it trivial, but it is nonetheless a tragedy. That warm-hearted, enthusiastic girl, all eagerness to see the man she loves do well. Archie, poor old Archie, all on fire to prove to her that her trust in him is not misplaced. In the end, disillusionment, disappointment, unhappiness. "He ought to keep his eye on the ball," said the more practical Sigsbee. "Quite possibly," continued McKay. "He has told her that he will win this championship." "If Archie's mutt enough to have told her that," says Sigsbee decidedly, "he deserves all he gets. Walter, 2 Scotch highballs." McKay was in no mood to subscribe to this stony-hearted view. "I tell you," he said, "I'm sorry for Archie. I am sorry for the poor old chap. And I'm more than sorry for the girl." "Well, I don't see what we can do," said Sigsbee. "We can hardly be expected to foozle on purpose just to let Archie show off before his girl." McKay paused in the act of lighting his cigar as one smitten with a great thought. "Why not?" he said. "Why not, Sigsbee? Sigsbee, you've hit it." "Eh?" "You have. I tell you, Sigsbee, you've solved the whole thing. Archie's such a bully good fellow. Why not give him a benefit? Why not let him win this championship? You aren't going to tell me that you care whether you win a tin medal or not?" Sigsbee's benevolence was expanding under the influence of the Scotch highball and his cigar. Little acts of kindness on Archie's part, here a cigar, there a lunch, at another time seats for the theatre, began to rise to the surface of his memory like rainbow-colored bubbles. He wavered. "Yes, but what about the rest of the men?" Sigsbee said. "There'll be a dozen or more in for the medal." "Oh, we can square them," said McKay confidently. "We will broach the matter to them at a series of dinners at which we will be joint hosts. They're white men who'll be charmed to do a little thing like that for a sport like Archie." "How about Gossett?" said Sigsbee. McKay's voice clouded. Gossett was an unpopular subject with members of the Cape Pleasant Golf Club. He was the serpent in their Eden. Nobody seemed quite to know how he got in, but there, unfortunately, he was. Gossett had introduced into Cape Pleasant golf a cheerless atmosphere of the rigor of the game. It was to enable them to avoid just such golfers as Gossett that the Cape Pleasanters had founded their club. Genial courtesy rather than strict attention to the rules had been the leading characteristics of their play till his arrival. Up to that time, it had been looked on as a rather bad form to exact a penalty. A cheery give-and-take system had prevailed. Then Gossett had come, full of strange rules, and created about the same stir in the community which a hawk would create in a gathering of middle-aged doves. "You can't square Gossett," said Sigsbee. McKay looked unhappy. "I forgot him," he said. "Of course, nothing will stop him trying to win. I wish we could think of something. I would almost as soon see him lose as Archie win, but after all, he does have off days sometimes." "You need to have a very off day to be as bad as Archie." They sat and smoked in silence. "I've got it," said Sigsbee suddenly. "Gossett is a fine golfer, but nervous. If we upset his nerves enough, he'll go right off his stroke. Couldn't we think of some way?" McKay reached out for his glass. "Yours is a noble nature, Sigsbee," he said. "Oh, no," said the paragon modestly. "Have another cigar?" In order that the reader may get the mental half-Nelson on the plot of this narrative, which is so essential if a short story is to charm, elevate, and instruct, it is necessary now for the nonce, but only for the nonce, to inspect Archie's past life. Archibald, as he had stated to McKay, was engaged to a Miss Milsom, Miss Margaret Milsom. How few men, dear reader, are engaged to girls with svelte figures, brown hair, and large blue eyes, now sparkling and vivacious, now dreamy and soulful, but always large and blue. How few, I say. You are, dear reader, and so am I, but who else? Archibald was one of the few who happened to be. He was happy. It is true that Margaret's mother was not, as it were, wrapped up in him. She exhibited none of that effervescent joy at his appearance which we like to see in our mothers-in-law elect. On the contrary, she generally cried bitterly whenever she saw him, and at the end of 10 minutes was apt to retire sobbing to her room, where she remained in a state of semi-coma till an advanced hour. She was by way of being a confirmed invalid, and something about Archibald seemed to get right in among her nerve centers, reducing them for the time being to a complicated hash. She did not like Archibald. She said she liked big, manly men. Behind his back, she not infrequently referred to him as a gaby, sometimes even as that guffin. She did not do this to Margaret, for Margaret, besides being blue-eyed, was also a shade quick-tempered. Whenever Mrs. Milsom discussed Archibald, it was with her son Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant Milsom, who thought Archibald a bit of an ass, was always ready to sit and listen to his mother on the subject, it being, however, an understood thing that at the conclusion of the séance she yielded 1 or 2 saffron-colored bills toward his racing debts. For Stuyvesant, having developed a habit of backing horses which either did not start at all or else sat down and thought in the middle of the race, could always do with $10 or so. His prices for these interviews worked out as a rule at about 3 cents a word. In these circumstances, it was perhaps natural that Archibald and Margaret should prefer to meet, when they did meet, at some other spot than the Milsom home. It suited them both better that they should arrange a secret tryst on these occasions. Archibald preferred it because being in the same room with Mrs. Milsom always made him feel like a murderer with particularly large feet, and Margaret preferred it because, as she told Archibald, these secret meetings lent a touch of poetry to what might otherwise have been a commonplace engagement. Archibald thought this charming, but at the same time he could not conceal from himself the fact that Margaret's passion for the poetic cut, so to speak, both ways. He admired and loved the loftiness of her soul, but on the other hand it was a tough job having to live up to it. For Archibald was a very ordinary young man. They had tried to inoculate him with a love of poetry at school, but it had not taken. Until he was 30, he had been satisfied to class all poetry, except that of Mr. George Cohan, under the general heading of punk. Then he met Margaret, and the trouble began. On the day he first met her at a picnic, she had looked so soulful, so aloof from this world, that he had felt instinctively that here was a girl who expected more from a man than a mere statement that the weather was great. It so chanced that he knew just one quotation from the classics, to wit, Tennyson's critique of the island valley of Avilion. He knew this because he had had the passage to write out 150 times at school, on the occasion of his being caught smoking by one of the faculty who happened to be a passionate admirer of the Idylls of the King. A remark of Margaret's that it was a splendid day for a picnic and that the country looked nice gave him his opportunity. "It reminds me," he said, "it reminds me strongly of the island valley of Avallon, where falls not hail or rain or any snow or ever wind blows loudly, but it lies deep meadowed, happy, fair, with orchard lawns." He broke off here to squash a hornet, but Margaret had heard enough. "Are you fond of the poets, Mr. Mealing?" she said with a far-off look. "Me?" said Archibald fervently. "Me? Why, I eat 'em alive." And that was how all the trouble had started. It had meant unremitting toil for Archibald. He felt that he had set himself a standard from which he must not fall. He bought every new volume of poetry which was praised in the press, and learned the reviews by heart. Every evening he read painfully a portion of the classics. He plodded through the poetry sections of Bartlett's familiar quotations. Margaret's devotion to the various bards was so enthusiastic, and her reading so wide, that there were times when Archibald wondered if he could endure the strain. But he persevered heroically, and so far had not been found wanting. But the strain was fearful. The early stages of the Cape Pleasant golf tournament need no detailed description. The rules of match play governed the contests, and Archibald disposed of his first three opponents before the 12th hole. He had been diffident when he teed off with McKay in the first round, but finding that he defeated the secretary with ease, he met one Butler in the second round with more confidence. Butler, too, he routed, with the result that by the time he faced Sigsbee in round 3, he was practically the conquering hero. Fortune seemed to be beaming upon him with almost insipid sweetness. When he was trapped in the bunker at the 7th hole, Sigsbee became trapped as well. When he sliced at the 6th tee, Sigsbee pulled, and Archibald, striking a brilliant vein, did the next 3 holes in 11, 9, and 12, and romping home, qualified for the final. Gossett, that serpent, meanwhile, had beaten each of his 3 opponents without much difficulty. The final was fixed for the following Thursday morning. Gossett, who was a broker, had made some frivolous objection about the difficulty of absenting himself from Wall Street, but had been overruled. When Sigsbee pointed out that he could easily defeat Archibald and get to the city by lunchtime if he wished, and that in any case his partner would be looking after things, he allowed himself to be persuaded, though reluctantly. It was a well-known fact that Gossett was in the midst of some rather sizable deals at that time. Thursday morning suited Archibald admirably. It had occurred to him that he could bring off a double event. Margaret had arrived at Cape Pleasant on the previous evening, and he had arranged by telephone to meet her at the end of the boardwalk, which was about a mile from the links, at 1 o'clock. Supply her with lunch and spend the afternoon with her on the water. If he started his match with Gossett at 11:30, he would have plenty of time to have his game and be at the end of the boardwalk at the appointed hour. He had no delusions about the respective merits of Gossett and himself as golfers. He knew that Gossett would win the necessary 10 holes off the reel. It was saddening, but it was a scientific fact. There was no avoiding it. One simply had to face it. Having laid these plans, he caught the train on the Thursday morning with the consoling feeling that, however sadly the morning might begin, it was bound to end well. The day was fine, the sun warm, but tempered with a light breeze. 1 or 2 of the club had come to watch the match, among them Sigsbee. Sigsbee drew Gossett aside. "You must let me caddy for you, old man," he said. I know your temperament so exactly. I know how little it takes to put you off your stroke. In an ordinary game you might take one of these boys, I know, but on an important occasion like this you must not risk it. A grubby boy, probably with a squint, would almost certainly get on your nerves. He might even make comments on the game, or whistle. But I understand you. You must let me carry your clubs." "Well, it's very good of you," said Gossett. "Oh, not at all," said Sigsbee. Archibald was now preparing to drive off from the first tee. He did this with great care. Everyone who has seen Archibald Mealing play golf knows that his teeing off is one of the most impressive sights ever witnessed on the links. He tilted his cap over his eyes, waggled his club a little, shifted his feet, waggled his club some more, gazed keenly toward the horizon for a moment, waggled his club again, and finally, with the air of a strong man lifting a bar of iron, raised it slowly above his head. Then, bringing it down with a sweep, he drove the ball with a lofty slice some 50 yards. It was rarely that he failed either to slice or pull his ball. His progress from hole to hole was generally a majestic zigzag. Gossett's drive took him well on the way to the green. He holed out in 5. Archibald, mournful but not surprised, made his way to the second tee. The second hole was shorter. Gossett won it in 3. The third he took in 6, the fourth in 4. Archibald began to feel he might just as well not be there. He was practically a spectator. At this point he reached in his pocket for his tobacco pouch to console himself with smoke. To his dismay he found it was not there. He had had it on the train, but now it had vanished. This added to his gloom, for the pouch had been given to him by Margaret, and he had always thought it one more proof of the way her nature towered over the natures of other girls that she had not woven a monogram on it in forget-me-nots. This record pouch was missing, and Archibald mourned for the loss. His sorrows were not alleviated by the fact that Gossett won the 5th and 6th holes. It was now 12:15, and Archibald reflected with moody satisfaction that the massacre must soon be over, and that he would then be able to forget it in the society of Margaret. As Gossett was about to drive off from the 7th tee, a telegraph boy approached the little group. "Mr. Gossett," he said. Gossett lowered his driver and wheeled round, but Sigsbee had snatched the envelope from the boy's hand. "It's all right, old man," he said. "Go right ahead. I'll keep it safe for you." "Give it to me," said Gossett anxiously. "It may be from the office. Something may have happened to the market. I may be needed." No, said Sigsbee soothingly. "Don't you worry about it. Better not open it. It might have something in it that would put you off your stroke. Wait till the end of the game." "Give it to me. I want to see it." Sigsbee was firm. No, he said. "I'm here to see you win this championship, and I won't have you taking any risks. Besides, even if it was important, a few minutes won't make any difference." "Well, at any rate, open it and read it." "It's probably in cipher," said Sigsbee. "I wouldn't understand it. Play on, old man. You've only a few more holes to win." Gossett turned and addressed his ball again, and then he swung. The club tipped the ball, and it rolled sluggishly for a couple of feet. Archibald approached the tee. Now there were moments when Archibald could drive quite decently. He always applied a considerable amount of muscular force to his efforts. It was in that direction, as a rule, he erred. On this occasion, whether inspired by his rival's failure or merely favored by chance, he connected with his ball at precisely the right moment. It flew from the tee, straight, hard, and low, struck the ground near the green, bounded on, and finally rocked to within a foot of the hole. No such long ball had been driven on the Cape Pleasant links since their foundation. That it should have taken him 3 strokes to hole out from this promising position was unfortunate, but not fatal. For Gossett, who seemed suddenly to have fallen off his game, only reached the green in 7. A moment later, a murmur of approval signified the fact that Archibald had won his first hole. "Mr. Gossett," said a voice. Those murmuring approval observed that the telegraph boy was once more in their midst. This time he bore 2 missives. Sigsbee dexterously impounded both. No, he said with decision. "I absolutely refuse to let you look at them till the game is over. I know your temperament." Gossett gesticulated. "But they must be important. They must come from my office. Where else would I get a stream of telegrams? Something has gone wrong. I'm urgently needed." Sigsbee nodded gravely. "That is what I fear," he said. "That's why I cannot risk having you upset. Time enough, Gossett, for bad news after the game. Play on, man, and dismiss it from your mind. Besides, you couldn't get back to New York just yet. In any case, there are no trains. Dismiss the whole thing from your mind and just play your usual, and you're sure to win." Archibald had driven off during this conversation, but without his previous success. This time he had pulled his ball into some long grass. Gossett's drive was, however, worse, and the subsequent movement of the pair to the hole resembled more than anything else the maneuvers of 2 men rolling peanuts with toothpicks as the result of some election bet. Archibald finally took the hole in 12 after Gossett had played his 14th. When Archibald won the next in 11 and the 10th in 9, hope began to flicker feebly in his bosom. But when he won 2 more holes, bringing the score to like as we lie, it flamed up within him like a beacon. The ordinary golfer, whose scores per hole seldom exceed those of Colonel Bogey, does not understand the whirl of mixed sensations which the really incompetent performer experiences on the rare occasions when he does strike a winning vein. As stroke follows stroke and he continues to hold his opponent, a wild exhilaration surges within him, followed by a sort of awe, as if he were doing something wrong, even irreligious. Then all these yeasty emotions subside and are blended into one glorious sensation of grandeur and majesty, as of a giant among pygmies. By the time that Archibald, putting with the care of one brushing flies off a sleeping Venus, had holed out and won the 13th, he was in the full grip of this feeling, and as he walked to the 15th tee, after winning the 14th, he felt that this was life, that till now he had been a mere mollusk. But just at that moment he happened to look at his watch, and the sight was like a douche of cold water. The hands stood at 5 minutes to 1. Let us pause and ponder on this point for a while. Let us not dismiss it as if it were some mere trivial everyday difficulty. You, dear reader, play an accurate scientific game and beat your opponent with ease every time you go to the links, of course, and of course so do I. But Archibald was not like us. This was the first occasion on which he had ever felt that he was playing well enough to give him a chance of defeating a really good man. True, he had beaten McKay, Sigsbee, and Butler in the earlier rounds, but they were ignoble rivals compared with Gossett. And defeat Gossett, however, meant the championship. On the other hand, he was passionately devoted to Margaret Milsom, whom he was due to meet at the end of the boardwalk at 1 sharp. It was now 5 minutes to 1, and the end of the boardwalk still a mile away. The mental struggle was brief but keen. A sharp pang in his mind was made up. Cost what it might, he must stay on the links. If Margaret broke off the engagement, well, it might be that time would heal the wound, and that after many years he would find some other girl for whom he might come to care in a wrecked, broken sort of way. But a chance like this could never come again. What is love compared with holding out before your opponent? The excitement now had become so intense that a small boy following with the crowd swallowed his chewing gum. For a slight improvement had become noticeable in Gossett's play, and a slight improvement in the play of almost anyone meant that it became vastly superior to Archibald's. At the next hole, the improvement was not marked enough to have its full effect, and Archibald contrived to have. This made him 2 up and 3 to play, what the average golfer would consider a commanding lead. But Archibald was no average golfer. A commanding lead for Archibald would have been 2 up and 1 to play. To give the public of his best, your golfer should have his mind cool and intent upon the game. Inasmuch as Gossett was worrying about telegrams, while Archibald, strive as he might to dismiss it, was haunted by a vision of Margaret standing alone and deserted on the boardwalk, play became, as it were, ragged. Fine putting enabled Gossett to do the 16th hole in 12, and when winning the 17th in 9, he brought his score level with Archibald's. The match seemed over, but just then, "Mr. Gossett," said a familiar voice. Once more was the much-enduring telegraph boy among those present. "Try this time," he observed. Gossett sprang, but again the watchful Sigsbee was too swift. "Be brave, Gossett, be brave," he said. "This is a crisis in the game. Keep your nerve. Play just as if nothing existed outside the links. To look at these telegrams now would be fatal." Eyewitnesses of that great encounter will tell the story of the last hole to their dying day. It was one of those titanic struggles which time cannot efface from the memory. Archibald was fortunate in getting a good start. He only missed twice before he struck his ball on the tee. Gossett had 4 strokes ere he achieved the feat. Nor did Archibald's luck desert him in the journey to the green. He was out of the bunker in 11. Gossett emerged only after 16. Finally, when Archibald's 21st stroke sent the ball trickling into the hole, Gossett had played his 30th. The ball had hardly rested on the bottom of the hole before Gossett had begun to tear the telegrams from their envelopes. As he read, his eyes bulged in their sockets. "Not bad news, I hope," said a sympathetic bystander. Sigsbee took the sheaf of telegrams. The first ran, "Good luck, hope you win, McKay." The second also ran, "Good luck, hope you win, McKay." So singularly enough did the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. "Great Scott," said Sigsbee. "He seems to have been pretty anxious not to run any risk of missing you, Gossett." As he spoke, Archibald, close beside him, was looking at his watch. The hands stood at 1:45. Margaret and her mother were seated in the parlor when Archibald arrived. Mrs. Milsom, who had elicited the fact that Archibald had not kept his appointment, had been saying, "I told you so," for some time, and this had not improved Margaret's temper. When, therefore, Archibald, damp and dishevelled, was shown in, the chill in the air nearly gave him frostbite. Mrs. Milsom did her celebrated imitation of the Gorgon, while Margaret, lightly humming an air, picked up a weekly paper and became absorbed in it. "Margaret, let me explain," panted Archibald. Mrs. Milsom was understood to remark that she dared say. Margaret's attention was riveted by a fashion plate. "Driving in a taximeter to the ferry this morning," resumed Archibald, "I had an accident." This was the result of some rather feverish brain work on the way from the links to the cottage. The periodical flopped to the floor. "Oh, Archie, are you hurt?" "A few scratches, nothing more. But it made me miss my train." "What train did you catch?" asked Mrs. Milsom sepulchrally. "The 1 o'clock. I came straight on here from the station." "Why," said Margaret, "Stuyvesant was coming home on the 1 o'clock train. Did you see him?" Archibald's jaw dropped slightly. No." "How curious," said Margaret. "Very curious," said Archibald. "Most curious," said Mrs. Milsom. They were still reflecting on the singularity of this fact when the door opened and the son of the house entered in person. "Thought I should find you here, Mealing," he said. "They gave me this at the station to give to you. You dropped it this morning when you got out of the train." He handed Archibald a missing pouch. "Oh, thanks," said the latter huskily. "When you say this morning, of course you mean this afternoon, but thanks all the same. Thanks very much." "No, Archibald Mealing, he does not mean this afternoon," said Mrs. Milsom. "Stuyvesant, speak. From what train did what train did Mr. Mealing alight when he dropped the tobacco pouch?" "The 10 o'clock, the fellow told me. Said he'd have given it back to him then only, but he sprinted off in the deuce of a hurry." 6 eyes focused themselves upon Archibald. "Margaret," he said, "I will not try to deceive you." "You may try," observed Mrs. Milsom, "but you will not succeed." "Well, Archibald?" Archibald fingered his collar. "There was no taximeter accident." "Ah," said Mrs. Milsom. "The fact is, I have been playing in a golf tournament." Margaret uttered an exclamation of surprise. "Playing golf?" Archie bowed his head with manly resignation. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you arrange for us to meet on the links? I should have loved it." Archibald was amazed. "Oh, you take an interest in golf, Margaret? You? Why, I thought you scorned it, considering it an unintellectual game. I thought you considered all games unintellectual." "Why, I play golf myself. Not very well." "Margaret, why didn't you tell me?" "Well, I thought you might not like it. You were so spiritual, so poetic. I feared you would despise me." Archibald took a step forward. His voice was tense and trembling. "Margaret," he said, "this is no time for misunderstandings. We must be open with one another. Our happiness is at stake. Tell me honestly, do you like poetry really?" Margaret hesitated, then answered bravely. "No, Archibald," she said. "It is as you suspect. I am not worthy of you. I do not like poetry." "Ah, you shudder. You turn away. Your face grows hard and scornful." "I don't," yelled Archibald. "It doesn't. It doesn't do anything of the sort. You've made me another man." She stared, wild-eyed, astonished. What do you mean? Do you mean that you, too?" "I should just say I do. I tell you, I hate the beastly stuff. I only pretended to like it because I thought you did. The hours I've spent learning it up, I wonder I've not got brain fever." "Archie, used you to read it up, too? Oh, if I'd only known." And you forgive me this morning, I mean?" "Well, of course. You couldn't leave a golf tournament. By the way, how did you get on?" Archibald coughed. "Well, rather well," he said modestly. "Pretty decently. In fact, not badly. As a matter of fact, I won the championship." "The championship?" whispered Margaret. "Of America?" "Well, not absolutely of America," said Archibald. "But all the same, a championship." "My hero." "You won't be wanting me for a while, I guess," said Stuyvesant nonchalantly. "Think I'll smoke a cigarette on the porch." And sobs from the stairs told that Mrs. Milsom was already on her way to her room. End of story number 9, Archibald's Benefit. Recording by Mike Harris. Chapter 10 of The Man Upstairs and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Man Upstairs by P.G.Wodehouse. Chapter 10, Story Number 10, The Man, the Maid, and the Miasma. Although this story is concerned principally with the man and the maid, the miasma pervades it to such an extent that I feel justified in putting his name on the bills. Webster's dictionary gives the meaning of the word miasma as an infection floating in the air, a deadly exhalation. And in the opinion of Mr. Robert Ferguson, his late employer, that description, though perhaps a little too flattering, on the whole summed up Master Roland Bean pretty satisfactorily. Until the previous day he had served Mr. Ferguson in the capacity of office boy, but there was that about Master Bean which made it practically impossible for anyone to employ him for long. A syndicate of Galahad, Parsifal, and Marcus Aurelius might have done it, but to an ordinary erring man, conscious of things done which should not have been done, and other things equally numerous left undone, he was just too oppressive. One conscience is enough for any man. The employer of Master Bean had to cringe before two. Nobody can last long against an office boy whose eyes shine with quiet, respectful reproof through gold-rimmed spectacles, whose manner is that of a middle-aged saint, and who obviously knows all the plod and punctuality books by heart, and orders his life by their precepts. Master Bean was a walking edition of Stepping Stones to Success, Millionaires Who Have Never Smoked, and Young Man, Get Up Early. Galahad, Parsifal, and Marcus Aurelius, as I say, might have remained tranquil in his presence, but Robert Ferguson found the contract too large. After 1 month he had braced himself up and sacked the punctual plodder. Yet now he was sitting in his office long after the last clerk had left, long after the hour at which he himself was wont to leave, his mind full of his late employee. Was this remorse? Was he longing for the touch of the vanished hand, the gleam of the departed spectacles? He was not. His mind was full of Master Bean, because Master Bean was waiting for him in the outer office, and he lingered on at his desk after the day's work was done for the same reason. Word had been brought to him earlier in the evening that Master Roland Bean would like to see him. The answer to that was easy. Tell him I'm busy. Master Bean's admirably dignified reply was that he understood how great was the pressure of Mr. Ferguson's work, and that he would wait until he was at liberty. Liberty? Talk of the liberty of the treed possum, but do not use the word in connection with a man bottled up in his office with Roland Bean guarding the only exit. Mr. Ferguson kicked the waste-paper basket savagely. The unfairness of the thing hurt him. A sacked office boy ought to stay sacked. He had no business to come popping up again like Banquo's ghost. It was not playing the game. The reader may wonder what was the trouble, why Mr. Ferguson could not stalk out and brusquely dispose of his foe, but then the reader has not employed Master Bean for a month. Mr. Ferguson had, and his nerve had broken. A slight cough penetrated the door between the two offices. Mr. Ferguson rose and grabbed his hat. Perhaps a sudden rush. He shot out with the tense concentration of one moving towards the refreshment room at a station where the train stops for 3 minutes. "Good evening, sir," was the watcher's view-hallo. "Ah, Bean," said Mr. Ferguson, flitting rapidly. "You still here? I thought you'd gone. I'm afraid I cannot stop now. Some other time." He was almost through. "I fear, sir, that you will be unable to get out," said Master Bean sympathetically. "The building is locked up." Men who have been hit by bullets say the first sensation is merely a sort of dull shock. So it was with Mr. Ferguson. He stopped in his tracks and stared. "The porter closed the door at 7 o'clock punctually, sir. It is now nearly 20 minutes after the hour." Mr. Ferguson's brain was still in the numbed stage. "Closes the door," he said. "Yes, sir." "Then how are we to get out?" "I fear we cannot get out, sir." Mr. Ferguson digested this. "I am no longer in your employment, sir," said Master Bean respectfully, "but I hope that in the circumstances you will permit me to remain here during the night." "During the night?" It would enable me to sleep more comfortably than on the stairs." "But we can't stop here all night," said Mr. Ferguson feebly. He had anticipated an unpleasant 5 minutes in Master Bean's company. Imagination boggled at the thought of an unpleasant 13 hours. He collapsed into a chair. "I called," said Master Bean, shelving the trivial subject of the prospective vigil, "in the hope that I might persuade you, sir, to reconsider your decision in regard to my dismissal. I can assure you, sir, that I am extremely anxious to give satisfaction. If you would take me back and inform me how I have fallen short, I would endeavour to improve. "We can't stop here all night," interrupted Mr. Ferguson, bounding from his chair and beginning to pace the floor. "Without presumption, sir, I feel that if you were to give me another chance, I should work to your satisfaction. I should endeavour to—" Mr. Ferguson stared at him in dumb horror. He had a momentary vision of a sleepless night spent in listening to a nicely polished speech for the defence. He was seized with a mad desire for flight. He could not leave the building, but he must get away somewhere and think. He dashed from the room and raced up the dark stairs, and as he arrived at the next floor, his eye was caught by a thin pencil of light which proceeded from a door on the left. No shipwrecked mariner on a desert island could have welcomed the appearance of a sail with greater enthusiasm. He bounded at the door. He knew to whom the room belonged. It was the office of one Blaithwaite, and Blaithwaite was not only an acquaintance but a sportsman. Quite possibly there might be a pack of cards on Blaithwaite's person to help pass the long hours, and if not, at least he would be company and his office a refuge. He flung open the door without going through the formality of knocking. Etiquette is not for the marooned. "I say, Blaithwaite," he began, and stopped abruptly. The only occupant of the room was a girl. "I beg your pardon," he said. I thought that they were—" He stopped again. His eyes, dazzled with the light, had not seen clearly. They did so now. "You!" he cried. The girl looked at him, first with surprise, then with a cool hostility. There was a long pause. 18 months had passed since they had parted, and conversation does not flow easily after 18 months of silence, especially if the nature of the parting has been bitter and stormy. Ferguson was the first to speak. "What are you doing here?" he said. "I thought my doings had ceased to interest you," she said. "I am Mr. Blaithwaite's secretary. I have been here a fortnight. I've wondered if we should meet. I used to see you sometimes in the street." "I never saw you." "No?" she said indifferently. He ran his hand through his hair in a dazed way. "Do you know that we're locked in?" he said. He had expected wild surprise and dismay. She merely clicked her tongue in an annoyed manner. "Again," she said. "What a nuisance. I was locked in only a week ago." He looked at her with unwilling respect, the respect of the novice for the veteran. She was nothing to him now, of course. She had passed out of his life, but he could not help remembering that long ago, 18 months ago, what he admired most in her had been this same spirit, this game refusal to be disturbed by fate's blows. It braced him up. He sat down and looked curiously at her. "So you left the stage," he said. "I thought we agreed when we parted not to speak to one another," said she coldly. "Oh, did we? I thought it was only to meet as strangers." "It's the same thing." "Is it? I often talk to strangers." "What a bore they must think you," she said, hiding 1/8 of a yawn with the tips of 2 fingers. "I suppose," she went on with faint interest, "you talk to them in trains when they're trying to read their paper." "I don't force my conversation on anyone." "Don't you?" she said, raising her eyebrows in sweet surprise. "Only your company, is that it?" "Are you alluding to the present occasion?" "Well, you have an office of your own in this building, I believe." "I have." "Then why—" "I am at perfect liberty," he said with dignity, "to sit in my friend Blaithwaite's office if I choose. I wish to see Mr. Blaithwaite." "On business?" He proved that she had established no corner and raised eyebrows. "I fear," he said, "that I cannot discuss my affairs with Mr. Blaithwaite's employees. I must see him personally." "Mr. Blaithwaite is not here." "I will wait." "He will not be here for 13 hours." "I'll wait." "Very well," she burst out. "You have brought it on yourself. You've only yourself to blame. If you'd been good and had gone back to your office, I would have brought you down some cake and cocoa." "Cake and cocoa," said he superciliously. Yes, cake and cocoa, she snapped. It's all very well for you to turn up your nose at them now, but wait. You've 13 hours of this in front of you. I know what it is. Last time I had to spend the night here, I couldn't get to sleep for hours. When I did, I dreamed that I was chasing chocolate eclairs round and round Trafalgar Square, and I never caught them either. Long before the night was finished, I would have given anything for even a dry biscuit. I made up my mind I'd always keep something here in case I ever got locked in again. Yes, smile. You'd better while you can. He was smiling, but wanly. Nobody but a professional fasting man could have looked unmoved into the inferno she had pictured. But then he rallied. Cake, he said scornfully. She nodded grimly. Cocoa? Again that nod, ineffably sinister. I'm afraid I don't care for either, he said. If you will excuse me, she said indifferently, I have a little work that I must finish. She turned to her desk, leaving him to his thoughts. They were not exhilarating. He'd maintained a brave front, but inwardly he quailed. Reared in the country, he had developed at an early age a fine, healthy appetite. Once, soon after his arrival in London, he had allowed a dangerous fanatic to persuade him that the secret of health was to go without breakfast. His lunch that day had cost him 8 shillings, and only decent shame had kept the figure as low as that. He knew perfectly well that long ere the dawn of day his whole soul would be crying out for cake, squealing frantically for cocoa. Would it not be better to... No, 1,000 times no, death, but not surrender. His self-respect was at stake. Looking back, he saw that his entire relations with this girl had been a series of battles of will. So far, though he had certainly not won, he had not been defeated. He must not be defeated now. He crossed his legs and sang a gay air under his breath. If you wouldn't mind, said the girl, looking up. I beg your pardon. Your groaning interrupts my work. I was not groaning, I was singing. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Not at all. 8 bars rest. Mr. Ferguson, deprived of the solace of song, filled in the time by gazing at the toiler's back hair. It set in motion a train of thought, an express train bound for the land of yesterday. It recalled days in the woods, evenings on the lawn. It recalled sunshine, storm, plenty of storm, minor tempests that burst from a clear sky, apparently without cause, and the great final tornado. There had been cause enough for that. Why was it, mused Mr. Ferguson, that every girl in every country town in every county in England who had ever recited "Curfew shall not ring tonight" well enough to escape lynching at the hands of a rustic audience, was seized with the desire to come to London and go on the stage? He sighed. Please don't snort, said a cold voice from behind the back hair. And there was a train wreck in the land of yesterday. Mr. Ferguson, the only survivor, limped back into the present. The present had little charm, but at least it was better than the cakeless future. He fixed his thoughts on it. He wondered how Master Bean was passing the time, probably doing deep breathing exercises, or reading a pocket Aristotle. The girl pushed back her chair and rose. She went to a small cupboard in the corner of the room, and from it produced in installments all that goes to make cake and cocoa. She did not speak. Presently, filling space, there sprang into being an odor, and as it reached him, Mr. Ferguson stiffened in his chair, bracing himself as for a fight to the death. It was more than an odor. It was the soul of the cocoa singing to him. His fingers gripped the arms of the chair. This was the test. The girl separated a section of cake from the parent body. She caught his eye. You'd better go, she said. If you go now, it's just possible that I may... Oh, but I forgot. You don't like cocoa. No, said he resolutely, I don't. She seemed now in the mood for conversation. I wonder why you came up here at all, she said. Well, there's no reason why you shouldn't know. I came up here because my late office boy is downstairs. Well, why should that send you up? You've never met him or you wouldn't ask. Have you ever had to face someone who is simply incarnate saintliness and disapproval, who... Are you forgetting that I was engaged to you for several weeks? He was too startled to be hurt. The idea of himself as a Ronald Bean was too new to be assimilated immediately. It called for mediation. Was I like that? He said at last, almost humbly. Oh, you know you were. Oh, I'm not thinking only about your views on the stage. It was everything. Whatever I did, you were there to disapprove like an aunt, she concluded triumphantly. You were too good for everything. If only you would just once have done something wrong, I think I'd have... But you couldn't. You're simply perfect. A man will remain cool and composed under many charges. Hint that his tastes are criminal, and he will shrug his shoulders. But accuse him of goodness, and you rouse the lion. Mr. Ferguson's brow darkened. As a matter of fact, he said haughtily, I was to have had supper with a chorus girl this very night. How very appalling, she said languidly. She sipped her cocoa. I suppose you consider that very terrible, she said. Well, for a beginner. She crumbled her cake. Suddenly she looked up. Who is she? She demanded fiercely. I beg your pardon, he said, coming out of a pleasant reverie. Who is this girl? Her name is Marie Templeton. She seemed to think for a moment. That dear old lady, she said. I know her quite well. What? Mother, we used to call her. Have you met her son? Her son? A rather nice-looking man. He plays heavy parts on tour. He's married and has two of the sweetest children. Their grandmother is devoted to them. Hasn't she ever mentioned them to you? She poured herself out another cup of cocoa. Conversation again languished. I suppose you're very fond of her, she said at length. I'm devoted to her, he paused. Dear little thing, he added. She rose and moved to the door. There was a nasty gleam in her eyes. You aren't going, he said. I shall be back in a moment. I'm just going to bring your poor little office boy up here. He must be missing you. He sprang up, but she had gone. Leaning over the banisters, he heard a door open below, then a short conversation, and finally footsteps climbing the stairs. It was pitch dark on the landing. He stepped aside, and they passed without seeing him. Master Bean was discoursing easily on cocoa, the processes whereby it was manufactured, and the remarkable distances which natives of Mexico had covered with it as their only food. The door opened, flooding the landing with light, and Mr. Ferguson, stepping from ambush, began to descend the chairs. The girl came to the banisters. Mr. Ferguson, he stopped. Did you want me? He asked. Are you going back to your office? I am. I hope you'll enjoy Bean's society. He has a fund of useful information on all subjects. He went on. After a while she returned to the room and closed the door. Mr. Ferguson went into his office and sat down. There was once a person of the name of Simeon Stylites, who took up a position on top of a pillar and stayed there, having no other engagements, for 30 years. Mr. Ferguson, who had read Tennyson's poem on the subject, had until tonight looked upon this as a pretty good thing. Reading the lines, thrice 10 years, thrice multiplied by superhuman pangs, in hunger and in thirsts, fevers and colds, in coughs, aches, stitches, ulcerous throes, and cramps, patient on this tall pillar I have borne, rain, wind, frost, heat, hail, damp, and sleet, and snow. He had gathered roughly, as it were, that Simeon had not been comfortable. Mr. Ferguson had pitied him, but now, sitting in his office chair, he began to wonder what the man had made such a fuss about. He suspected him of having had a touch of the white feather in him. It was not as if he had not had food. He talked about hungers and thirsts, but he must have had something to eat, or he could not have stayed the course. Very likely, if the truth were known, there was somebody below who passed him up regularly supplies of cake and cocoa. He began to look on Simeon as an overrated amateur. Sleep refused to come to him. It got as far as his feet, but no farther. He rose and stamped to restore the circulation. It was at this point that he definitely condemned Simeon Stylites as a sybaritic fraud. If this were one of those realistic Zola-esque stories, I would describe the crick in the back but let us hurry on. It was some 6 hours later, he had no watch, but the numbers of aches, stitches, not to mention cramps, that he had experienced could not possibly have been condensed into a shorter period, that this manly spirit snapped. Let us not judge him too harshly. The girl upstairs had broken his heart, ruined his life, and practically compared him to Roland Bean, and his pride should have built up an impassable wall between them, but she had cake and cocoa. In similar circumstances, King Arthur would have grovelled before Guinevere. He rushed to the door and tore it open. There was a startled exclamation from the darkness outside. "I hope I didn't disturb you," said a meek voice. Mr. Ferguson did not answer. His twitching nostrils were drinking in a familiar aroma. "Were you asleep? May I come in? I've brought you some cake and cocoa." He took the rich gifts from her in silence. There are moments in a man's life too sacred for words. The wonder of the thing that struck him dumb. An instant before, and he had had but a desperate hope of winning these priceless things from her at the cost of all his dignity and self-respect. He had been prepared to secure them through a shower of biting taunts, a blizzard of razor-like "I told you so's." Yet here he was, draining the cup and still able to hold his head up, look the world in the face and call himself a man. His keen eye detected a crumb on his coat sleeve. This retrieved and consumed, he turned to her, seeking explanation. She was changed. The battle gleam had faded from her eyes. She seemed scared and subdued. Her manner was of one craving comfort and protection. "That awful boy," she breathed. "Bean?" said Mr. Ferguson, picking a crumb off the carpet. "He's frightful." "Oh, I thought you might get a little tired of him. What has he been doing?" "Talking. I feel battered. He's like one of those awful encyclopedias that give you a sort of dull, leaden feeling in your head directly you open them. Why, do you know how many tons of water go over Niagara Falls every year?" "No." "He does. I told you he had a fund of useful information. The Purpose and Tenacity books insist on it. That's how you catch your employer's eye. One morning the boss suddenly wants to know how many horsehair sofas there are in Brixton, the number of pins that would reach from London Bridge to Waterloo. You tell him and he takes you into the partnership. Later you become a millionaire. But I haven't thanked you for the cocoa. It was fine." He waited for the retort, but it did not come. A pleased wonderment filled him. Could these things really be thus? "And it isn't only what he says," she went on. "I know what you mean about him now. It's his accusing manner." "I've tried to analyze that manner. I believe it's the spectacles. It's frightful when he looks at you. You think of all the wrong things you've ever done or ever wanted to do." "Oh, does he have that effect on you?" he said excitedly. "Why, that's exactly describing what I feel." The affinities looked at one another. She was the first to speak. "We always did think alike on most things, didn't we?" she said. "Of course we did." He shifted his chair forward. It was all my fault," he said. "I mean, what happened." It wasn't. Yes, it was. I want to tell you something. I don't know if it will make any difference now, but I should like you to know it. It's this. I've altered a good deal since I came to London. For the better, I think. I'm a pretty poor sort of specimen still, but at least I don't imagine I can measure life with a foot rule. I don't judge the world any longer by the standards of a country town. London has knocked some of the corners off me. I don't think you'd find me the Bean type any longer. I don't disapprove of other people much now, not as a habit. I find I have enough to do keeping myself up to the mark." "I want to tell you something, too," she said. "I expect it's too late, but never mind. I want you to hear it. I've altered, too, since I came to London. I used to think the universe had been invented just to look on and wave its hat while I did great things. London has put a large piece of cold ice against my head and the swelling has gone down. I'm not the girl with ambitions any longer. I just want to keep employed and not have too bad a time when the day's work is over." He came across to where she sat. "We said we would meet as strangers, and we do. We never have known each other. Don't you think we'd better get better acquainted?" he said. There was a respectful tap at the door. "Come in," snapped Mr. Ferguson. "Well?" Behind the gold-rimmed spectacles of Master Bean there shone a softer look than usual, a look rather complacent than disapproving. "I must apologize, sir, for intruding upon you. I am no longer in your employment, but I do hope that in the circumstances you will forgive my entering your private office. Thinking over our situation just now, an idea came to me by means of which I fancy we might be enabled to leave the building." "What?" "It occurred to me, sir, that by telephoning to the nearest police station—" "Good heavens!" cried Mr. Ferguson. 2 minutes later he replaced the receiver. "It's all right," he said. "I've made them understand the trouble. They're bringing a ladder. I wonder what the time is. It must be about 4 in the morning." Master Bean produced a Waterbury watch. "The time, sir, is almost exactly 10:30. "10:30? We must have been here longer than 3 hours. Your watch is wrong." "No, sir. I am very careful to keep it exactly right. I do not wish to run any risk of being unpunctual." "10:30?" cried Mr. Ferguson. "Why, we're in heaps of time to look in at the Savoy for supper. This is great. I'll phone them to keep a table." "Supper? I thought—" She stopped. "What's that?" "Thought what?" "Hadn't you an engagement for supper?" He stared at her. "Whatever gave you that idea? Of course not." "I thought you said you were taking a Miss Templeton—" "Oh, Miss Templeton." Oh, his face cleared. "Well, there isn't such a person. I invented her. I had to when you accused me of being like our friend the Miasma. Legitimate self-defense." "I do not wish to interrupt you, sir, when you are busy," said Master Bean, "but—" "Come and see me tomorrow morning," said Mr. Ferguson. "Bob," said the girl, as the first threatening mutters from the orchestra heralded an imminent store of melody, "when that boy comes tomorrow, what are you going to do?" "Call up the police." "No, but you must do something. We shouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for him." "You know, that's true." He pondered. "I've got it. I'll get him a job with Rakes and Courtney." "Why Rakes and Courtney?" "Because I have a pull with them, but principally," said Mr. Ferguson, with a devilish grin, "because they live in Edinburgh, which, as you are doubtless aware, is a long, long way from London." He bent across the table. "Isn't this like old times?" he said. "Do you remember the first time I ever—" Just then the orchestra broke out. End of story number 10, The Man, the Maid, and the Miasma. Recording by Mike Harris.